You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. I have Rachel Fulton Brown. She's an associate professor of history, part of the Department of History at University of Chicago. And we're going to talk about some of her research surrounding Christianity. So, Rachel, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me, Richard.
If you would, tell me a bit about your background. How did you turn towards these studies, and what's a bit about your background?
Well, the executive summary is I was an undergraduate at Rice University in Houston. I was a graduate student at Cambridge University in England and at Columbia University in New York. And I've been teaching at the University of Chicago since 1994. I grew up Presbyterian. I spent many decades worshiping in the Anglican Church, Episcopalian Church here in the United States. And I was received into the Catholic Church in 2017, 4 years ago. My research covers the history of Christianity, and my teaching is wide-ranging around questions of civilization and creativity, and with a special emphasis on Tolkien. Well,
quick question. So what is your research around Tolkien about? Just the man himself, or the stories, or what's the focus of it?
So that I do a course that I've taught on campus since 2005, every several years, on Tolkien, medieval and modern. And the idea is to understand the way in which Tolkien, as a Catholic, drew on medieval understandings of creativity and imagination to, I think, try to touch the modern world with some of those same insights. And I've been making a video series for the last year that's published on Unauthorized TV. You have to subscribe to that. It's a subscription channel, but it's called The Forge of Tolkien, and I talk through his stories and the way in which he understood the problem of creation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've read Tolkien, and I read the Silmarillion, I guess, where he goes into the creation of the world, and it's his version of it. So, but I guess a more general question: what in the medieval times, what was the state of Christianity and Catholicism? What was it like back then versus modern times? What did they believe that was different?
So I've been reading a lot of Marshall McLuhan recently, and if you know his work, he's writing in the 1960s and sort of meditating on the differences that different media have on our experience of the world, because he thought about the media that we use, like language, but also literacy, writing by hand versus printing. And now, as we're doing this kind of work, in the electric age, right, we're in this digital connection. And his insight, and he was a Catholic as well, so a convert like I am, that he understood that the way in which we experience the world is directly affected by these media that we're participating in. And in my study of medieval Christianity, I've been very interested in the practices of devotion and liturgy, and for example, developing prayer practices modeled on the monastic offices, the divine offices, that specifically focused on praying to Mary, right? And over the course of the High Middle Ages, the monks and then lay people adopt from the monks practices of saying the Psalms on a sort of hourly schedule, right? There's a particular schedule for the divine office, and those are copied into manuscript books, but then transformed into print in the first several decades of the printing press. And reading McLuhan is making me think a lot about the differences between the kinds of books that are produced in the Middle Ages for prayer versus the expectations that we have of devotion and prayer after the development of the printing press. And the primary difference, to get to your particular question, the primary difference between medieval Christianity and modern Christianity is that medieval Christianity you can see is very local and very grassroots. And this is something I didn't properly understand until I was reading McLuhan, that the medieval prayer practices, that they're individualized by region, but also by town. The manuscript books will be very, very personalized, right? You might have your own set of prayers that you say, you might write into them, you might have particular pictures. Once the printing press comes in, not just the Protestants in the 16th century, but also the Catholics start making, mechanically reproduced books. And you end up with a culture in which you expect prayer to be regular and, formal in a sort of mechanically reproduced way. So I think what most modern Catholics and Protestants think of as, the religion that we practice through specific text has been completely transformed by the fact that, if you're saying the prayers in the Middle Ages, they're very personalized and very intimate. And if you're saying them after the printing press, it's this abstracted thing that's coming to you in this mechanically reproduced way. Now, what's interesting is, of course, we're not living in that exclusively print world now. We're living in this digital world. And I've also therefore been thinking a lot about the way in which, all of our religious experiences are being affected by our ability to communicate as you and I are right now, electrically, right? And that electrical experience is much more tactile, right? The technical term is haptic, right? You have the touch of it's interesting. It's like this numerical touch. I think one of the things that we're experiencing right now in our culture at large is this feeling of being connected again, in ways that back in the villages, people were connected, but at this kind of hyper intense. All of our senses are being overly stimulated by the electrical waves that we're engaged in, and how that's going to change our prayer practices. I'm very interested to think about. But I think one of the things it's doing is creating little villages of communication, somewhat like the sort of grassroots developments of the Middle Ages. So we'll see, right? It's like we're in a new moment yet again in the way in which we engage with each other, and therefore the way in which we think about liturgy and prayer.
Okay, so has anyone gathered up a big swath of like the medieval prayers to compare them? Like what did people do? They went to church, and then because things really weren't written, they just kind of made their own prayers based on what they heard, and they wrote it down for themselves, or how did it work?
Well, I wrote a book about it.
That's very cool.
The book is called Mary and the Art of Prayer. And in the first chapter, I take you through in very specific detail exactly what prayers they're developing. No, they're not just making up their own. They're drawing from a repertoire of prayers. What they're doing is assembling them in ways that are, specific to the communities that they're saying them in. So, for example, in the monastic world, you may be familiar. I don't know whether your audience will be familiar, but there are a number of different religious orders that develop over the Middle Ages. So there are Benedictines, there's Cistercians, Dominicans, Franciscans, Carmelites, Carthusians, Premonstratensians, Augustinian friars, and each of those communities ended up with a different version of the texts. Different parishes and dioceses would also have different. So there's a communal element to the variations. It's not completely like you just make up your own stuff, but it's more like what people do on social media now, if you're kind of assembling things that you see out there in the world, lots of pictures, lots of texts, and putting them together in your own sort of scrapbook version. I think that's a little closer.
But there's prayer memes or anything.
Oh, they definitely had prayer memes. That's the
really?
point, right? Prayer memes are, for example, the spread of the devotional iconography, right? From the 11th or 12th century, you get many more pictures and sculptures of Christ on the cross, right? And over the course of the period, they get more and more gory because the meditation is on the suffering that he went through for our sake, for our salvation, which I can talk about. But when you think about the replication of all of those images, one, to have your own crucifix in your church, or your statue of Mary, or your altarpiece showing the Annunciation, you had to commission an artist to make one. We do see that they are making them on patterns, right? It's like, you'd have your own version of Mary as the throne of wisdom. And we've got lots of those in wood, right? And pretty much every altar would probably have one. But yours would be yours, right? This one you have specific to your own church. Before you can make photographs of everything and see everybody's, right? I think you get much more of a sense of, our Mary is that image that we have in the church, which is not idolatry, because you're not expecting that Mary statue to do the prayers for you, but you are intimate and local in a way that is harder once we're in the printed context. But now I think with social media, everybody's responding as if everything that touches them is very, very personal. And I think that way, in that we're sort of closer to the medieval.
Well, all right. So did certain prayers win out? I would think, I guess political forces would cause certain prayers to become the standard as printing came about, and other ones to fall away. Were you able to find ones that were lost over time, or were you able to trace the evolution of which ones became the mainstream?
Well, the one that became the mainstream if you're not Catholic. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. I mean, one of the things that happens is you get abbreviated versions of things that everybody picks up. So the rosary develops in the period. With printing, it's easier to promote these particular devotions, but the sense of a political winning out, well, yes. I mean, following the Council of Trent, the Catholic Church licenses certain books and versions to be printed. And I guess you could say that's a political response, but the real political response is things like England's Book of Common Prayer, because that is mandated by the government, right? So you need to think about who's doing the standardizing, who's doing the issuing and licensing. That we lost certain practices, we lost certain prayers. I mean, with the Hours of the Virgin in the later Middle Ages, there's as many as different as well. We have records of as many as 600 different variants in the assemblage of text, right? So imagine that every single account on social media put together their favorite versions of the selection. There are some stable elements, like the Psalms that are for Matins are very specific, but you put them all together. And in the 16th century with the printing press, one version gets picked out and says, this is the one we're going to license and print. And it's called the Use of Rome, but it was originally the Franciscans variant. So, I mean, it's a fascinating problem, because to say, what was it? You think of the medieval church as all rigid and determined. And in fact, it's the printed versions. It's the early modern printing that creates the rigidity.
What about scripture? Was that on a separate track, a separate path? Was this considered as vital as scripture? Was it literally canonized, or is this more of a loose process, with the prayers?
The scripture is affected the same way as everything else, right? And so I started down this particular rabbit hole path a few weeks ago, because I'm thinking about a paper that I was asked to write on the Gospels, spoken and written. And what you realize for the medieval period, for the pre-printing period, we'll say, thinking about how people knew the Gospels is very dynamic, right? They know them from liturgies that they attend. They know them from the art that's in the churches. They know them from sermons that they heard on the feast days. There's a range of ways in which people encounter the stories. So certainly people in the Middle Ages knew the Gospels, but with the printing press and, with people like Luther making the argument that you should read, sola scriptura is sufficient, although I'm not actually sure that Luther made that argument in those terms, but it's an artifact. It's literally an artifact of being able to produce these machine-made books. And then instead of the gospel being something that you encounter because you're thinking about the story of the Passion on Good Friday, it becomes this thing you read in a book and sort of abstracted out of your experience. It's a curious thing, because it makes it much more distant and fixed than it was experienced in the pre-printing period.
Yeah, what would it be like to be told, a story of the gospel by your mother or someone in your community, or your local preacher, versus reading it out of the book? How do you think the experience would be different?
Well, to mention your mother reading to you, right? One of the ways that we know people learned to read in the Middle Ages was, their mothers reading with them. The images of the Virgin Mary's mother, Anne, reading to her, right? But the way they learned to read was from these books of hours that I'm talking about, these prayer books or psalters, right? So what's interesting about learning to read at the time, it had different functions, right? You could learn to read in the towns because you're in the merchant class and they are setting up schools so the children were literate and numerate and so forth. But the texts that you would learn to read from would be first of all, the Psalms, right? So the very first thing you'd be working with learning to read, even as a child, would be prayers, right? So I think your experience of what reading means is very different. It's like you're not reading because you're reading for a private experience like a novel, right? You're reading because this gives you the ability to voice I want to say text because that makes us think about those books, right? But you're reading to be able to voice the prayers that everybody is saying, right? It's a communal thing. And stories you're going to encounter as much, told, recited by storytellers as you are privately reading them in a book. And even ones that are written in a book, they'll say things like, Lords, listen to this wonderful story. And we assume that means they're being performed in some way. They're scripts. They're more like plays. And that's another way that particularly in the later Middle Ages, medieval Christians would know the Gospels. They know the whole Bible stories because they'd seen them in plays, these cycles of plays that are performed in the towns.
What was the fidelity of the stories? How reliable were they? I guess because they came out of oral tradition until they were written down. And then when the printing press came, now they can be widely disseminated and enforced. But what was it like? What was scripture like? I guess originally, it was oral tradition. Like what would have been the experience of someone learning it?
You're showing your prejudice, your literate prejudice. Oh, it's unreliable and malleable, right? In fact, it was actually very stable as text. No, it was, I do. It was very stable as text. However, stories grow in the telling. And that's, if you think about a play, right? For example, Jesus Christ Superstar. How reliable is that, right? That's a story told on it's a play, right? Movie, musical, told on the basis of the Gospels, or any movie now that purports to show you the actual experience of Jesus at the crucifixion. That sort of desire to be in the story, the desire to see, the actual events, that is also something that we see in the Middle Ages, that there's a famous collection of meditations called the Meditations on the Life of Christ. And the idea is, imagine yourself in the scene, there in the scenes. And, the Gospels are fairly spare in some of their details. And so, for example, with the crucifixion. And so one of the meditations in the Meditations on the Life of Christ is how many nails did they use, right? It's not said. And so could it be 3? Could it be 2? If you're trying to represent these things in your mind, imaginatively and visually, you need to know certain details. And what's interesting about those kinds of details is they develop them by reading the Old Testament and things like the Psalms, which describe the suffering of the Savior. So, when you're asking how accurate it is, then we have to talk about what accuracy means, because we have this particularly 19th century idea that, the historical Jesus, and we really know who he was. That's just as much fantasy as any medieval meditation on the reality of the crucifixion. We're filling in things based on our judgments about what reality is.
What kind of picture do you get having looked at all you looked at, having seen all these old prayers and all these different, oral tradition stories that have come and then eventually coalesced into different versions of scripture? Like what is the picture do you look like? What do you think it actually was like back in Jesus's day? Did you have any new insights from all your study?
In Jesus's day or in the Middle Ages?
Well, Middle Ages first, and then I don't know if you extrapolate back from there or if you just stick to the Middle Ages, but let's, if you can't answer both, but start with Middle Ages and then, let's go backwards if you can.
What I've learned in thinking through this McLuhan lens for the past few weeks, which is new to me, but I was also reading it because one of my teachers in college was a great New Testament scholar, Werner Kelber, and he got us started in thinking about these problems in the course I took on Jesus and history with him. This was at Rice in Houston. That it's hard for us sort of habituated to asking questions through our textual world to get back to what it was like without that as the thing that we use to define rational or the thing that we use to define, provable. One of the things Professor Kelber taught, his own writing about the Gospel of Mark, for example, which I studied with him in this class 35 years ago, was how he could see the gospel, the evangelists, right? The evangelists themselves are taking the stories that were in circulation in the first century and putting them together in narratives that themselves have very specific arguments. And this is it's a standard thing in New Testament scholarship that each of the four gospels has a different audience that they're assuming, and therefore different kinds of questions that they're asking and answering for their own communities. And, so the exercise of saying, what was the historical Jesus like? Well, it's fraught from the beginning because the texts themselves are theological to begin with, right? They're not trying to give us this transparent historical variant. But if you're a Christian, you know that, right? Because you understand that everything that we see is only understood properly through Christ, right? Through looking at it. So even, questioning, do we know what it was really like in the Roman period? Well, you are assuming that the Gospels aren't real in this kind of secularizing. Another book I'm reading right now is Henry Sienkiewicz's Quo Vadis, which is set in Nero's reign. And it's an interesting meditation because it's trying to imagine what it would have been like in Rome when Peter and Paul are still alive, right, before they're martyred, and what it was like for the early Christian, the very earliest Christians to know who Jesus was and what it meant to be Christian. What I say when I talk about this in my classes is the reason we care so much in our tradition is precisely because we worship a Lord who became incarnate in history, and so we really, really care that this is a real historical event, and that his entry into time and his effect on us as human beings is because he became truly, actually incarnate in time, and that is what the Gospels say. But then to understand what that means, you have to really believe that the creator of the world entered into his creature. I think that Christians in the Middle Ages had a stronger grasp of that, for sure.
What do you think has been lost by this, assimilation of all these different stories and traditions into, literally, I guess, canon? The printing press has said now, because we can print this, some force is going to dominate what it looks like, and it's going to be standardized. So, again, what do you think has been lost today that we would have enjoyed back in the medieval age?
Joy. I think the joy has been lost. And one of the things that I try to do in my teaching and my scholarship, and we're working on this in a class right now that I'm doing on writing Christian poetry. Yesterday, we were talking about the fall, right? And we were reading Milton and Paradise Lost and talking about what happens with Satan. And Milton famously makes Satan allegedly appealing. But the fall that we've lived through in modernity is this fracture of our ability to see the spiritual and material worlds as interconnected and filled with the light of God. It's like what we see in the Middle Ages is people building those great cathedrals, right, which are containers for light. That's the whole point of those giant windows that they develop in the Gothic architecture, that you have, and not just light, but colored light, right? So you have this amazing experience of being inside this giant gemstone, if you're in one of those cathedrals, which is then filled with music because of the choirs. They're singing the Psalms, which is meant to replicate the way in which the angels sing praises to God in heaven, and that correspondence between heaven and earth is, embodied in both their devotion and their intellectual work, through the 13th and 14th centuries. And, for me, the thing that we lose with that printed variant is the lived worship of the liturgy. Now, to say, well, of course, people still go to church and people still sing and so forth now, but the more you are convinced that your spiritual life is something private and interior and like the romantic artistic subjectivity versus our Enlightenment conviction that with science we can see reality because we know how to measure it and talk about the material world and its functions, that the Enlightenment is the big psyop of modernity, right? Claiming that it's enlightened and the previous periods were dark. No, we have been darkened and blinded by this. The image that just came to me is when you think about the brain and you have, they do those surgeries on epileptics by cutting the corpus callosum so that the two sides of your brain can't talk to each other anymore. Our culture is kind of like that. We've had the surgery of the Enlightenment to cut our affect from our intellect, and we can't see anything clearly anymore.
I don't know. Can you say a little bit more about that? Like what do you think is now hidden from our view? Like what? So in the medieval times, I would guess a lot of people's perception is like they were brutes back then. You know, they didn't care about life and they just clubbed each other to death and took each other's money. And now we're enlightened and we're sensitive and we're culturally aware and blah, blah, blah. Is that accurate? Or in medieval times, were they just the same as we are?
Well, this is where the McLuhan sort of meditation on the media is important. They didn't have the mechanical reproducibility stuff, so they weren't mechanized in the way that we are. And, therefore it's easy to get it. One, I don't want to get sort of nostalgically woo-woo, everything was, sweetness and light in the period. We live in a fallen world and we have since Eden, right? Which going back to Milton, thinking about Paradise Lost, right? That, the fall comes when Satan enters into the garden and hates it, right? He hates all of creation. He hates the animals. He hates the plants. He hates he particularly hates the human beings, but even hates the dirt. He hates everything material and comes in and persuades Adam and Eve, particularly Eve to start with, that he persuades her that she deserves to be worshipped as a goddess or deserves to be seen, right? It's like the sight is very, you deserve to be seen by more than just Adam here. That one of the things in the Middle Ages people were very conscious of is sin, and the need to train in virtue, to do penance, to appreciate the ways we're caught up in our vices, our appetites, and our passions, and so forth. That I think what modernity has is we don't believe in sin for the most part. We have some crude versions of, if we can fix society, everybody will behave well. But that's like, we want to make a better machine so all the animals in it aren't, behaving disgustingly. That's Luciferian, right? That's Satan saying, I hate humanity. And if you really want to feel this, what I feel right now in our world right now is we despise the human. And if you look at the way in which people are being forced into participating in the digital world, by way of surveillance and, tracking and things like that, that's satanic in its despite of the dirt. We're dirt. What's interesting for the Middle Ages, they're dirt, they know it, and yet they also understand the joy of being made in the image and likeness of God and invited by God to create. So if you want to say, our modern cathedrals are giant skyscrapers with glass on the outside that reflects the sky, and the people inside live in little boxes, concrete boxes. The Middle Ages, you make cathedrals with the light streaming in, and that's where the people go to worship.
I see what you mean. So nowadays, anyone that goes to a church, they're not going to be working on anything inside the building. I mean, at best, they may be doing like decorating for the holiday, for Christmas, but they're not constructing anything. They're not making statues. They're not making buildings. They're not, I guess, doing devotional works of art. Is what you mean? Like people are just going with this pre-made, prefabricated, mass-produced religion that they participate in. Is that what you mean?
No, sorry. I actually meant skyscrapers are our present day analogs to the cathedrals, right? It's like the skyscrapers had spires that reach to the sky, right? And I live in Chicago, so we have a lot of tall buildings here. We don't spend as much energy building churches, and a lot of the churches we build now are ugly, or look like stadia if they're really big or something like that. No, what I meant was we don't actually build Gothic cathedrals now, obviously.
But not only that,
but we don't even know how to worship for the most part as a culture, which is not saying that nobody now worships. So saying, you're asking me what's the difference between now and the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, the biggest building in the town would be the cathedral, even taller than the castles, which the secular authorities are exerting power from. Now the tallest buildings that we have are business offices.
Right, but what do you mean that people don't know how to worship today? What's missing?
All we look at is ourselves. We fall into the temptation that Satan in poem gives Eve. It's like, you should be seen, right? You should be seen by the world. We worship celebrity. We worship hits on our social media. We worship people who can become incredibly wealthy, and therefore we're basically worshiping, ourselves as it's the image of satanic always, but it's this technological prowess that we think gives us power over each other and the world. And I'd say that's we the energy that we put into those kinds of connections and making, that's what we worship. We're idolaters for the most part.
So I guess it's interesting. So we worship humanity's achievements instead of God, and at the same time, we also seem to have this building self-hatred of ourselves. So it's a weird dichotomy, I guess.
That's well described. It. That's exactly it.
Oh,
yes,
we hate ourselves. Anything?
Satanic. Because I told you, I mean, it's good that I was reading Milton yesterday, right? That Milton, he describes how Satan despises everything, right? It's like he's fallen because he fell out of the refusal to worship, right? Satan falls from heaven because heaven is hierarchical for a good reason, right? It's like the angels in heaven worship the creator. And going back to Tolkien and his themes, right? He uses this in his Silmarillion. And the Ainulindale, right? The Ainur who sing in the theme of creation that Iluvatar proposes are in proper relationship with him as creator, whereas Morgoth, who wants he thinks that Iluvatar doesn't give sufficient attention to the void and goes off into the void and wants to make his own stuff, right? Lucifer falls because he doesn't want to accept the freedom that comes from his obedience to the praise of God. That's where, but the thing is that he ends up hating himself too, right? It's like if you fall from worship of God, interestingly, what you end up with is no power and simply self-loathing.
And you think, I guess, en masse, that's where humanity is at right now, in a self-loathing spot?
Yeah, I mean, we're to the point where we don't even want to breathe, which is very, very interesting, right? It's like, we to the degree that we're masked, we're not breathing. I think I have a medium meditation on this, that electronic voices, you're my voice. I can't hear you breathe. Oh, I can hear you breathing, but I'm nowhere physically in contact with your actual physical breathing, right? All of these voices that we hear electronically have no breath, right? So I think it's very, very interesting that we're in a moment where not being able to breathe is the primary experience.
That's very, very sad state of affairs. For your students, what do you have recommendations for them? I mean, you teach, you show them what you've discovered, but in general, for friends, family, people you care about, listeners, like what are some recommendations that you'd make based on what you've seen and know, if people are interested in deepening their faith and just having more of a joy in the world and coming out of this, again, this dichotomy of self-hatred and absolute belief and scientific progress only?
Say the Psalms. And it's like, a lot of people say the rosary. What's interesting about the rosary is it was originally called the Psalter. There were 150 Aves because it was meant to substitute for the Psalter, in fact, right? But if you say the Psalms, I mean, that was one of the classes I've taught was on the sort of the Psalms in medieval culture. But what you understand is this prayer life, it develops because the monks in the monasteries are saying the Psalms all the time, and that you are becoming one with the church in your voice, right? And I do think it helps you say them out loud because you're breathing them, right? So I said this argument about you must breathe out loud. We must use our voices that we make with our lungs, and our tongues and our lips and our facial muscles. We have to embody the word. So my primary recommendation is get the Psalms and start saying the Psalms. The one that everybody, if you learned one Psalm in the Middle Ages, it would be the Miserere Mei, which you may be familiar with in Allegri's magnificent setting for it. But Psalm 50 in the Vulgate, Psalm 51 in the King James Version. Tolkien he recommended to his sons that they say the praises, right? And those are the texts that you get out of St. Lauds, right? So particularly Psalm 148, which is all the creatures praising the Lord, and also the Benedicite, which is again all the creatures praising the Lord. Those will give you joy. Those will connect you back with Greek creation if you start saying those prayers out loud with your breath. Now, I have some other suggestions too, but start there.
Well, sure. What are your other suggestions?
So with my students right now, the reason we were reading Milton is I'm teaching a course on writing Christian poetry. And I've been working with a group that I've put together online in my Telegram chat. We called the Dragon Common Room. And we've been writing poems in the old style, right? In iambic pentameter, modeled on the great Christian writers like Alexander Pope. And we're working on one now that's going to be modeled on Edmund Spenser, Fairy Queen, that you are disciplining yourself to the beauty of, both our language. It's like writing in meter and rhyme. You have to attend to the sounds of the words. It's not just, the sense, right? That there's an oral element to, the older styles of poetry, but also thinking of our engagement with the world through our imaginations, right? One of the books we're reading for the Writing Christian Poetry is Malcolm Geet's study on faith, theology, and hope. I think that's not the right title. It's his birthday today, so this is that we have in the modern world. We have this idea that the only reason is the way that we access understanding, and he's saying no, the imagination was always meant to be part of it. And if we're fallen, our reason is just as fallen as our imagination. So don't worry about that. The Enlightenment is another psyop, because I think reason is the great tool that we have. We should have both our imagination and our reason. And poetry is, an effort to sort of make beauty in understanding, and therefore is a marvelous vehicle. Is not quite the word, but embodiment of our understanding of the incarnation. So you can follow my work. The poets are publishing a new poem called Aurora Borealis, which is a children's book, which you have pictures for. It's also illustrated, and that's going to be out in the next few weeks from our Dragon Common Rooms books. You can make art, right, and do it with, but not just make anything like, you're going to express your interior, right? You are making art that's creating with the world, and to find the way that in the older tradition, both the human being and the world itself are part of the great symphony, I suppose, of God speaking.
Well, very good, Rachel. It's been a really good call. What's the best way for listeners to find out more about your work? Where can they go? Where can they get your books and find out more about you?
So I have a homepage. It's through my hosted at the University of Chicago on our homepage sites, but you can find it just by Googling Rachel Fulton Brown. If you find the Wikipedia page, you might be a little alarmed, but it's got links to my homepage. I have a blog called Fencing Bear at Prayer, where I post about my work, and be looking for dragoncommonroom.com, where we'll have information about our poems. We're working on that website right now. That'll be up in a week or so, probably.
Okay, well, very good. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for the conversation. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.